Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very, very much for attending, and really especially thanks to CCSN for the opportunity for us to partner in bringing this to you. My name is DURHANE WONG-RIEGER, and I am the President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. And I am just delighted to be speaking with you today, really to bring to you what is maybe the first presentation we've done on this strategy since we actually had it announced at our conference in the end of March. So what I'm going to talk to you today is the rare disease drug strategy as we have been developing it over the last 3 years with the federal government and alongside the federal government. And now where we are today and what we need to do in terms of looking forward. So we've put this in the title is Delivering on Canada's Promise of Value-Based Access to Drugs for Rare Diseases. And I'm really thrilled to actually be doing this with the cancer community because, as you know, rare diseases also includes rare cancers. But I think more importantly, as we would all know, is that at some point, I think we will all have a rare disease, even the most common of diseases, as we're getting to better ability to find the exact genetic genomic cause of the diseases. And also as we have more and more precision medicines to be able to really target not only the disease, but also really to target the disease within the patient characteristics. So thank you very much. I think I'm happy to have people, if they want to put questions in the chat, but probably we'll work through the presentation first and hopefully have lots of time at the end for questions or for comment, quite frankly. Would love to have some commentary, especially, from, beyond just our own rare disease community. Okay. So this is just presentation of CORD. CORD, hopefully many of you will know, we are the network of patient organizations for rare diseases. About 100+ patient groups are our membership, and mission and mandate, as you can see, they're really to improve lives for everybody affected and to really advance policy, advance the access to clinical trials and access to new therapies, and also work to develop the patient group capacity, support research, and collaborate. All of which I hope we will touch on as we talk about the rare disease drug strategy and what we're calling the rare disease strategy alongside of it. So this is probably not a surprise to many of you here. It is the case that rare diseases are a lot more common than you think. With over 8,000 rare diseases, we used to say 6, and then we started to say 7, and now we believe there are 8,000, and some people are telling us there could be 10,000 rare diseases, depending on how you want to define it. Canada has a working definition of rare diseases that certainly Health Canada, Canadian Institutes of Health Research have all used, even though there's nothing that's officially stamped in it. It is the basis of what we talk about, and that is diseases that affect very small patient populations with a number of something like 1 in 2,000. But as many of you know, many of these conditions affect people that are, many of these are much rarer than that. But if we think about the number, there's more than 3.2 million that could be identified with rare diseases. And here actually are 2 very prominent Canadians who have stepped forward to identify the fact that they are, dealing with rare diseases. Celine Dion fairly recently this past year, and Justin Bieber, whom we saw very publicly, had to cancel a number of his meetings. Both of them have conditions that are, at this point, have no known true therapy, though lots of care and management. But I'll talk a little bit about maybe one of the conditions that actually is very close to the one that Celine Dion has and actually does have a treatment. So this is the way in which we traditionally have been advocating for rare disease patients and rare disease drugs and rare disease access to screening, diagnosis, etc. I think many of you hopefully are, familiar with this. I say hopefully because if we're not out there being active, if we're not out there being visible, then we're not doing a good enough job in terms of raising awareness around the issues that we're dealing with. But as you also know, this is not a way to make policy. This is not a way in which you can affect change in any sustainable, truly effective way. But it is important in terms of getting attention. So this is, I don't think we'll ever stop doing this. I do think that we hopefully will be doing more than just standing outside in the freezing cold, and that we get inside of the building that's behind us, and we get to not only to the legislative tables, but we also get to the policy making tables, which is in fact what I'm going to be talking about. Where and how is this drug strategy being rolled out, and how did we get here? But this is how we started, right? We started with the fact that there were people who were suffering, and there are people who need access to treatment, and there were people whose voices were not being heard. Really, the impetus toward it and why it's continued to be called a drug strategy, is, I think, as many of you know, any of you who have been struggling to get access to a therapy or to a new therapy, or even to an old therapy, may be really aware, is that in Canada, the access to a rare disease strategy is or access to rare diseases therapies are prolonged. It takes a long time, and there are many steps along the way. And you can see there, I won't belabor it because I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's what we call this very slow multi-step. And honest to gosh, it feels like a stairway, right? You start with the, an application for clinical trials, an application for regulatory approval, or what they call a notice of compliance. You get to that step, and then you end up, kind of waiting for it to be looked at by your health technology assessment groups. CADA's in most of Canada, INEST in Quebec, and that can take, 7 months at best. Then you're kind of talking about trying to get to the point where it's make an application, especially for many of these therapies, which needs to be funded publicly because of the very high cost. Therefore, certainly individuals, families, and certainly to any drug plan, it then goes for assessment. And then it goes beyond that, right, to getting, if it gets to the stage where there's a negotiation, it still has to get to each one of the public drug plans, to get the ministries of health, to get the drug plans to actually make them available to patients who are on those drug plans. And then if we get there, we may get the access to the patients. And the steps are long, the steps take a lot of time. And in fact, what we're looking for is what I call over here, we want that express outlet. We want a single stop that would let us get to certainly where some of the private drug plans are, though we are seeing increasingly challenges with the private drug plans in making these drugs available and to getting to access. And this is just a capsule. Under the best of circumstances, if everything works, this is how long it takes. It takes almost 2 years from the time it gets to where Health Canada says, fine, this drug is safe, it's effective, we believe it has added value, we should be making it available to patients. It's almost 2 years, 1.5, 2 years before that drug actually can be available in a drug plan. Doesn't mean it actually gets to patients. So this is the challenge we've got. And as you would all appreciate, that's a long time when you're talking about serious diseases, progressive diseases, diseases for which there are not adequate treatments. This is a really important thing for us to know here in Canada, though, and the lead up to this is kind of what we've said before, right? Is that in Canada, the access to rare disease drugs is actually quite rare. It's quite painful. It starts with the very fact that drugs that are already approved by the European Medicines Agency, and also not in here is the FDA. If in fact we start with 63 drugs, so in a year that the EMA might approve, only 44 of those get approved here in Canada. This is the first step, right? Health Canada says, yes, they're safe and effective. We've already dropped down now some good 20, 1/3 by then. Of those 44 that Health Canada says, okay, we should make these rare disease drugs available to patients, there's an added benefit to them, and sometimes even in an expedited review, there's an urgent need for them. Only 30 of those goes to the Health Technology Agency, comes out and says, okay, we should actually put those on the public plan. So again, we've now lost, about 25 percent or more of those drugs, a third of those drugs. Now, and in fact, INES, which we all recognize sometimes is doing a better job than maybe CADIF in terms of their assessments, actually there's an even lower percent. Of those 30 drugs that get through with a recommendation, only 24 of those drugs actually get to the point where there's a price negotiation and they get recommended into the formularies. Doesn't mean they're available yet, but at least they go to the province and says, here's the price. You should be now negotiating or making them available through your drug plan. So this is what we started with. We start with 63 is what the EMA has. We get down to 24, which are actually available to Canadians. And these are not trivial drugs that are being dropped off along the way. Sometimes these are drugs, again, that are life-saving, life-altering, first drugs for a condition, the most effective drug for a condition. And yet, at the end of the day, we end up with, very small numbers. These are not Me Too. These are not trivial additions. So this just so to kind of give you a little bit of a schematic to this, right? And includes kind of what, in terms of the FDA, so 66% are approved, we get a rejection of 1/3, as we said before. This is something that's very important to look at then.
Teacher hack I've gotten from TikTok.
This is, also important to look at is that this is how long it takes in order to get these drugs here. So if the FDA starts off and saying, yes, we're going to list these drugs, first year after that, it's only 16% to come to Canada. 30% gets here by the second year. By the 5th year after the FDA has already approved these drugs and made them available, 60% gets into Canada. So when I said before, only 44 out of 66 of EMA drugs, and if we look at the FDA, it's the same kind of placement scenario. What we can see here as well is that the time delay is tremendous. So what do we have? And this is the same thing. I don't want to belabor it. I just want to be able to kind of show you again that when it goes to the health technology assessment, CADIF and INES, again, the delay is very, very long in terms of getting the drugs into to patients, into the clinic, into the drug plans. The challenge we often hear is how expensive these drugs are. And all of you would know that certainly many of these new innovative therapies can be very expensive, whether we're talking about cancer therapies, we're talking about new auto-inflammatory therapies, certainly with rare disease therapies. But the reality is that, in fact, especially with some of these drugs, the number of patients that are affected and would benefit from it are so small that the total expenditure is very, very small. So this is what we spend in public health. This is what we're spending in terms of drugs for rare diseases out of the public budget. So when we're told, we can't afford it, it would bankrupt the system, it would absolutely kind of overwhelm our public health system. Okay, right. It's what I heard a bit earlier. It's talking about the impact. It's like a butterfly flapping its wings and the impact it has on a tornado that's outside. This is the tornado, and this is us here as a butterfly flapping our wings. I don't think we're causing a whole lot of disruption here. And when we look at it in relative to what we spend on other kinds of public health spend, other kinds of even drugs, we recognize this is not what we call budget breaking. So the challenge we seem to have in Canada that seems to kind of keep coming to us is that, well, we can't afford these, and the only thing we can do, right, is that we can either choose. We can have new technologies, amazing technologies, life-altering, life-saving, highly effective therapies, and getting more and more to gene-based precision therapies, digital healthcare, which includes wearables, e-health, the use of electronic health records. We can bring in all of these technologies, or we can have balanced budgets. And we've got limited health financing. We've got limited amounts of money that we can actually make available. And so we got one or the other that we can have, right? I mean, as I'm sure all of you would say, that's false. This is not the case. We can either have, innovation and technology, or we can just balance our budget. And then balancing our budgets, meaning spending no more with all the innovations that are coming in than we're spending right now, making no changes in how we're spending in order to absolutely make room for new technologies. One of the challenges in Canada, quite frankly, is that we, unlike almost every other developed country, does not have an orphan drug policy. We do not have a rare disease strategy. We have had no priorities to rare diseases. And this goes all the way back to 1983, when the US introduced its first rare orphan drug policy. Other countries that have adopted orphan drug legislation really to support the research and development of new therapies and to make them more readily available, most notably the European Union around 2000. All of these countries coming in, and Canada is still sitting on the fence, and in fact, in one respect, actually denying the need of any kind of orphan policy, explicitly saying we don't have to do it in Canada, the US is developing drugs, we don't have to do anything like that. So this has been our problem all along, the emphasis of innovation, the de-emphasis of providing incentives, lack of recognition that innovative therapies are essential in terms of patients and the benefits. So of course, we were thrilled when in fact, there was in fact the announcement of a rare disease drug strategy. This was made in 2019. Some of you may not have been paying as much attention as we were, but we were quite pleased. In February 2019, right before the new budget was coming out, the Health Canada, or not, the federal government announced that there would be $1 billion that would be allocated to a rare disease drug strategy to be made available over 2 years, starting in 2022-23, and to be built into the budget, $500 million a year to absolutely sustain it. Last 3 years, we have been, immediately after the announcement, we had an election. So Liberals got reelected, so that election promise remained in there, though it actually had been put into the budget. And then as we began to push for consultations on this drug strategy, COVID hit. And so everything was diverted over to COVID, and the government continuously said, we don't got time to do this. We're doing some other things. We got COVID to worry about. So as any patient would, any patient group would, we said, fine, we'll undertake the consultations ourselves. We began to host everything from just roundtables, webinars, forums, to virtual conferences, where we brought forth the need for not just the rare disease drug strategy, but for us, the bigger issue of rare disease strategy. And we began to consult on what would you do with $1 billion in order to optimize care and treatment for patients with rare conditions. And so we spent the next 2.5, 3 years doing the consultations. Health Canada did come into the consultations somewhat late in the game and hosted a number of roundtables. By that time, we were quite pleased because we were well advanced in terms of the consultations we had done and the bringing together of all the stakeholders. In fact, we kind of smiled when Health Canada, when they did their first round of consultations in 2020, came back to say, well, that was amazing. 2021, we did all these consultations and we found a high amount of consensus among the stakeholders as to what would be the optimal use for these therapies, which was not a surprise because we've been working on this for at least the past 2 years. So that was kind of like the good news part of it. The bad news part of it, of course, is that there was still no real plan for implementation, and we were at 2021, looking at 2022 was when this was to be rolled out, and we were still at just the talking stage with no concrete proposals on the table. We had a series of sort of one-on-one conversations with them. We had smaller offerings with them. One of the things that came forth.
No, I'll get another layer.
If other people are on, could you just make sure you're on mute? Thanks. Okay, so what we did get was a recommendation, quite frankly, that we should take the monies and put the bulk of it into creating a list of drugs for rare diseases that could be funded, equitably across the country. We were absolutely not in favor of this as a proposal. We have been pushing for an investment in infrastructure. We have been pushing for an investment in doing screening and testing, an investment in centers of expertise where we could actually do good diagnosis, have patients have access to specialists. We were really pushing for an investment in a data platform where we can absolutely capture patient information, be able to monitor how well they're doing on a therapy. We also wanted to have investment in research, that it is not good enough that we rely on other countries to actually to create the therapies, but Canada has tremendous research capacity. We should be investing in the research, and not just in drugs, but also research in quality of care, research in terms of the best ways in which we can optimize the availability of the drugs. But we really felt that, it was very short-sighted to say we will just put the funding into creating a list of drugs. This was not a preferred strategy. And in fact, nobody said it was a preferred strategy. So we didn't, have much more that came through in terms of a concrete proposal until about maybe about 6 months prior to the actual announcement, when we had some real meetings with the federal government that indicated that they understood what we were talking about and that there needed to be much broader reach in terms of the drug strategy, that it was not meant to cover just drugs, but we need to be able to optimize our overall rare disease program. It still is a little, so this is the announcement that was made March 22nd, 2023. Minister DeClode, kind of made what we call the long-awaited rare disease drug strategy, about 1.4 billion. So instead of just being $1 billion, it was now announced as $1.5 billion over 3 years. 1.4 billion of that will be allocated through agreements with the provinces and territories to, as they have kind of loosely said, to improve access to new and emerging drugs, which is good, to support enhanced access to existing drugs, which is good, to even out inequities, but also investment in early diagnosis and screening for rare diseases, and to be able to, from our point of view, better monitor the use of these therapies and better monitor the actual impact of the therapies. 68 million would be for initiatives to improve consistent access to drugs for rare diseases. Again, some of this is still very high level and without deep details in terms of what that would actually mean, but some of it really around having the ability to have data platforms that we can actually manage, but also to be able to support the introduction of drugs. Importantly, there is now 32 million of this that would be made available for to advance research on rare diseases. So developing better diagnostic tools, establishing a Canadian Rare Disease Clinical Trials Network. This is really important because, as you would all know, having drugs available through clinical trials and having them available early is really critical when we're talking about having clinical expertise into it, patient early access to these therapies, but also creating then an infrastructure in which these drugs could be made available, including the screening and testing. And then 20 million to CADTH and to CAI to improve the collection and use of evidence to support decision making. It's very, very critical that we're able to continue to collect information on the appropriate use of drugs, and then creating infrastructure that would actually help to monitor and manage the technologies. Some of this is still very vague, but they did very explicitly talk about the implementation of an advisory group to support the implementation of the strategy. We have really pressed for and, understanding that within that there is meant to be consultation and access to patients throughout this process. So this is the high level announcement. Now, of course, the hard work comes in terms of how do we implement this, because we still don't have any agreement yet with the provinces. We do have the announcement or pre-announcement of the research that's taking place. The other parts of it, there is not really, I think, a deep level of detail yet, but I think we'll start to see some of that. And we, again, as a rare disease community, want to make sure that we're part and parcel of those discussions. At the same time, we've been pleased because many of these are going to be made into bilateral agreements. Quebec, as we know, just this past May 1, had released their action plan for the rare disease policy that they announced last year. We're hoping very much that Ontario will pick up the work that they began in 2017, a working group on rare diseases. I've done some tremendous amount of work to creating a rare disease strategy. And it certainly coincides with the Life Sciences Ontario Vision paper that was put out last fall. So what we need to be able to be doing is to actually now link up the federal drug strategy with provincial strategies and getting the provinces to start to buy into signing these agreements so that we can start to implement the monies that are made, implement the plans, the programs that are available, and to actually begin to dispense the monies that have been put into the agreements. Again, still work to be done, a lot of it, but at least we are seeing some movements on the ground. We've had some good drugs. So what is it that really is necessary, though, in order to optimize this? I think this is what we're all talking about. You know, it's not good enough to have a list of drugs. It is important that we make sure that we optimize the availability of these drugs. And it's the same formula I think that all of you are aware of, that we've been living on, you know, all of this time. And that is, how do you optimize, you know, drug investments? You need to make sure, and especially with rare disease populations, especially with targeted precision therapies, is that you need to make sure you're getting the right drug, that you know the population, that you absolutely can make sure that you're identifying the targeted individuals there. But over time, of course, it means that you're going to have to monitor. So getting the right drug to the right patient. The right patient is critical. You know, it isn't just, okay, we can have a diagnosis of a rare disease, or we can have a diagnosis around, you know, an approximate disease, or we can have a delayed diagnosis. Getting these drugs to the right patient, diagnosing that patient, whether it's through newborn screening, it's early genetic testing, it's through genomics, it's more precision testing, getting them to the specialist so that we can get a good therapeutic decision. I mean, again, we see the huge parallels, right? In cancer, where you have now many, you know, more targeted therapies, and the goal is to get the absolute most accurate diagnosis, you know, down to what are the genetic genomic mutations that are involved. Can we find a specialist that knows that and knows the breadth of therapies there to help you make the right decision, and then being able to continue to monitor that patient on a local level. The right time, and again, speeding up the availability of these therapies. We all live here in Canada knowing there's so many therapies that are available just south of the border that are not here in Canada. And yeah, sometimes if you're really lucky or you're really desperate, you can go south of the border. You can enroll yourself in clinical trials. You can get access to a specialized program. And sometimes you can even find a way of being able to pay for them, though given the cost of therapies these days, that becomes increasingly remote. But we need to get it to the right time. Part of what is important in this right timing, though, is recognizing that not every drug is going to work for everybody, and not every drug comes into Health Canada approval full understanding which part of that population it works for. And it doesn't necessarily come in with really strong data in terms of how long it's going to work and exactly what is going to be the impact. So we need to be able to have processes that allow us to provide access in what we call a real world basis, that we can have criteria that allow us to start those drugs even without full, you know, knowledge in terms of how well they're going to work for how long as they meet the Health Canada regulatory safety and effectiveness standards, that we set up a process where we can manage and monitor these patients, right, in real time. The same as you get a chemo. I mean, not every chemo works for every patient, right? 60% of the time it works, 40% of the time it may not, but you need to get access. You need to try it. And you need then to be able to continue to monitor and collect the data to know whether or not it's working. And you need to look at it from an individual basis. So yes, you know, I've got a 60% solution, but most of us are not 60%. We are individuals. And so we need to be able to assess, and we need to be able to be monitored on an individual basis to see what does work, what doesn't work. How do we start, you know, what is it that would indicate that we should continue or not? And then we need to be able to accumulate that data to end up with some population assessment. As we're making these drugs available, continue to collect the information for that population, especially for a rare disease population where there's not a whole lot of patients available, there's not that much data, and we need to be able to continue to monitor them in real time. One of the best examples of this is the pediatric cancer monitoring that is being done out of British Columbia. Again, the goal is to be able to monitor patients, who are enrolled in, pediatric cancer treatments, identify those who respond really well, identify those who don't respond well or may have adverse events, and then over time be able to use the data, the characteristics of those patients, from genetics to other characteristics about them, to actually be able to predict when patients come into are diagnosed and coming into being treated, actually have a prediction as to who would actually benefit, who should not be started, and who would need to be closely monitored. So this is the pathway that we already have. It's in Canada. We're doing it. We're doing it for some condition. We just don't have it systematized. We don't have the resources to do it. And we're not really doing that last part where we're analyzing the data. So none of this is new. All of this exists as is. It just isn't done very well. It isn't well funded. I remember we had the conversations with Health Canada on this, and they asked, like, how much of this currently exists? What is new? And we say, like 90% of it exists. We just need to get it to the point where it's actually going to be available.
Hold on.
And so the last part here is having it at the right price. And we do know some of these therapies are individually expensive. Some of these would need to be risk shared so that there would be agreements with the company bringing them in terms of assuming the risk in terms of early access, making decisions around at what point, one would be able to move it from an introductory to a more sustainable availability, and starting price. I mean, we saw before that, sometimes it's negotiating the price at the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance level that will hold things up, sometimes for as much as 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And the goal is to get drugs started, get a starting price, and then be able to have agreement after we've got the drug available and we've been monitoring over time. So this is the optimizing. So this is what we've been talking about, and this is why we say at the end of the day, in order to have optimal benefits from a $1.5 billion investment in a rare disease drug strategy, you got to invest in the rare disease infrastructure. You got to go beyond just saying, how much am I going to pay for a drug and how many patients are going to get available to that drug? You've got to create a framework that would allow you to be able to diagnose, to be able to do precision testing, and then to be able to make sure you've got the right specialists who are able to monitor. This is kind of what we're challenged with a lot of times. This is the patient journey. I think many of you would know that. Patient journeys are oftentimes thinking about, okay, you have to go in, you have to get a diagnosis, you get a diagnosis, you get to a specialist, you get to a specialist, you get worked up for a care and treatment plan, and then off you go. And of course, what we know in rare diseases, but in many, many other diseases as well, right? It's a really messy, messy journey. And it's a messy journey that in real life can take a very long time. In Canada, it can take up to 4 years to get the diagnosis. In Canada, with a rare disease, you can get 4 and sometimes up to 12 wrong diagnoses along the way. This is obviously hugely impactful for patients and family. The wrong diagnosis means not only don't you get access to the right treatment or the right intervention, if it's not even a drug treatment, but you may get prescribed the wrong treatment and actually have worse outcomes. So this is what we talk about. We talk about, in many cases, patients looking online themselves, looking for patient groups, looking for options, from the internet. We talk about going from specialist to specialist. We know that, in Canada, again, it takes, patients are referred to and will visit, somewhere around, again, 4 to 7 specialists before they actually get to the right specialist. The goal is to create these centers of expertise where the patients, regardless of where they are, can actually be diagnosed, entered into a registry, and then be able to make sure that they are included in the right clinical trials and then be able to get access along the way. So all of this is part of what we're trying to look at in terms of creating a system that would actually reduce the kind of false leads and loops that are in the system, and also reduce the time it takes to get from initial symptoms to the point where you're getting the right treatment. This is just a brief little shot of it to kind of look at, and we did some research very recently, but also look at the literature. 1 out of 15 babies is born with a rare disease. 24,000 babies each year. 80% of these are genetic, but even with the genetic disease, about 50% of the time it comes into a family with no known disorder. It takes up to 4 years to get that diagnosis, sometimes up to 13 years after the first symptoms. This is, still the case. About 30% of babies that have a rare disease will die before their 5th birthday. Sometimes it is because there's nothing you can do. There's no known treatment. The disease may actually progress, without the ability to actually intervene, even if you've diagnosed it. In some cases, it's because the children are not diagnosed. We know that in many cases, these children, if they were diagnosed at birth with comprehensive newborn screening, you can intervene. Sometimes with just a change in their diet, they can actually avoid symptoms and actually lead to pretty normal, life. What we do know still is that despite our fact that we've got so many new therapies, look like they're coming in, only 5% of rare diseases has an approved therapy. So we've got a long way to go. That's why we want to invest in the research. We also know that in many cases, even though, we're talking about children with rare diseases, many rare diseases, will not appear. Even if it's a genetic condition, symptoms don't begin to show until much later in life. Even if, there are indications, we may not get any kind of real diagnosis until much later. What we do know, and is that some of these adult onset disorders, you will know some of them. One of the groups that, amyloidosis, for instance, there's a huge range of it, but usually not until later in life. When you look at things like, ALS, which can be earlier in midlife, but also can be quite later in life. Alzheimer's, which of course can be quite late in life. Some of these diseases do not appear. And I will say we do a terrible job of diagnosing them. We do a terrible job of being able to provide the information, oftentimes to general practitioners, that these are the indications that, in fact, this might not just be old age or might not be normal, that there is something that's seriously wrong. The same as we have been trying to do here at this end, we also need to look at the funding. I put in here hemophilia only because I love the idea that, in the early 80s, 90s, when we only had, cryoprecipitates, patients with hemophilia lived to be about their mid-30s. Now they're living to be 73 years old, and more we know there are patients with rare conditions with treatment and right monitoring care that are living to a much older life. So what does a program look like? What are we calling for in terms of optimizing this rare disease drug strategy? Creating centers of expertise, sort of like we have cancer centers. This is the idea. We would have rare disease centers, importantly, rare disease centers that can be hubs in terms of specialists, that can also be connected with the community physicians, connected to pediatricians, connected to each other, because it's unlikely that you will have in any one location all the specialists for all rare diseases. So how do you get connected and actually connected internationally? That we have a designated pathway for getting access to drugs rapidly without going through all of that stairway that we talked about before. Drug approval, managed access scheme that would allow us to decide which patients get started. How do we monitor them in real time? How do we collect that information? How do we determine whether or not the drug is working for them individually on a group level? How do we make sure that the negotiation over price doesn't interfere with the ability to access? We can always address price later. I mean, this is what other countries do. And then that we have a good research network, starting with a really good clinical trials network that would encourage companies, encourage researchers to come to Canada, that we have a good genetics and genomics research program. Again, it goes back to, we've got to be able to diagnose these patients, and we should be able to diagnose them accurately in real time to be able to determine what kinds of care and treatment they need, and then creating the data platforms, best practice guidelines, et cetera. So these are what we consider to be the 3 pillars. And the platforms that we feel are essential that underlie these pillars are a patient data platform. We've got to be able to collect all the patient information, including their, electronic health records, to patient input platforms where patients can actually provide the information about how well they're doing, and a patient engagement platform. Throughout all of this, patients have to be front and center. Patients are not only just to be consulted, but they need to be part of the decision-making part of the implementation, the same as we're doing right now. So this is the goal here. This is, again, our notion of a rare disease network, which would include centers of excellence, research networks, would include the outreach to the patient, to the general practice community, intermediate, but also to community service, because rare diseases, as in all diseases, is not just a medical condition, it's an economic condition, it's a social impact condition, it's an educational condition. It requires other kinds of services and support and ongoing evaluation, and many of those are oftentimes there in the community. This is, again, a bit of a stylized notion of it. So here's your centers for centers of expertise, disease-specific ones, so it could include hemophilia, muscular dystrophy, include some of the pediatric centers, patient organizations as being a key component of it, and this is what's in the community, and all of it is networked together. This is not just a vision in Canada. This is the vision that is happening in Europe. This is the vision that's happening certainly in globally through the WHO recommendations. So I'm going to finish up by just talking about what is available in terms of the orphan drug programs. You know, as we said before, you know, Canada stood alone in not having any kind of orphan drug program. Canada did announce this, as we said, in 2019, and now begin to implement it. There's still key differences in what Canada is doing, though, and what other countries are doing. What we don't have is this innovative pathway that absolutely, this is what NICE got in the UK, their National Institute on Clinical Excellence really lays out a process for what do we do with innovative therapies, and that includes any kind of innovative therapy, including special funding, Innovative Medicines Fund, Cancer Drugs Fund, a Promising Innovation Medicines Program, and an Innovative Licensing and Access Program. What the UK has said clearly is we welcome innovation, and we're going to create pathways for innovation. We're going to try to not only foster this innovation and to make it, developed here, but we're also going to try to make it available to patients much more rapidly. We don't have that problem. There's no recognition that innovation is critical in terms of the future for patient care. Yes, we're going to put a drug fund together, but where's the emphasis in terms of how do we absolutely continue to, drive the innovation? This is, again, just a repeat of that. I'm not going to go through all of this, but again, to say in other countries, there's much more explicit recognition that there's a benefit in terms of having innovative therapies and putting it front and center. There's also the recognition that health technology assessment, needs to be changed in order to make it work for rare diseases. In most other countries, there is not a dollar threshold that says this is the most that we will pay for quality adjusted life year for a therapy, and certainly not for rare disease therapy. Canada has stubbornly, through Canada, insisted on $50,000 per quality adjusted life year. And then they come back with an estimate that says, well, this drug has a quality adjusted life year of $1 million. And then they say, go ahead, provinces negotiate for a price. And you can't make it available until you negotiate it for a price. That's a yes that turns into nothing but a long, long, protracted delay. Frustrating for certainly patients and families, but also very devastating. So I won't belabor this. I'll leave it in the slide deck. You can look at it. Every other country that we know of has other kinds of ways of providing early access, of making therapies available over a short period of time, of not limiting drugs just because of the overall cost per quality. And certainly you get countries like Germany, it basically says, look, make the drug available for immediately. And in fact, if the budget impact is less than X, we don't even want to go through an HTA process, just make it available, because the impact in the overall budget is not worth having this protracted kind of an assessment. We're not going to learn much. We're not going to get much back from it. And certainly, again, in terms of Italy, where they've done lots of these managed access schemes, make it available first, collect the information, analyze the information. Now let's decide, is it working? Is it not working? What is the right price based on what we're learning in terms of the outcomes? Even Australia has put forth a priority and a provisional pathway, though I do not take Australia as my blueprint for what a great rare disease drug program looks like. And this is Canada, which again, I'm not going to belabor, but it really says, we're really so different in terms of where we are now relative to many of the other countries and able to make drugs or innovative drugs a priority and really emphasizing to make them available. I'll finish just by saying, what we're pushing for is these managed access schemes, and it really is nothing more than, providing coverage, collecting the information, and then determining who benefits, who doesn't, and what the actual return on value is at the end of the day. These are other countries that have been able to kind of come up with these kinds of schemes a little bit more, sort of a repeat of what you saw in a schematic way. And the same here. I should just start with the schematic, but it's kind of fun. So this is what we're proposing, and it is a combination of what you saw there. Have patient access, multi-stakeholder groups there. We screen the patients identified to know we screen the drugs ahead of time. We know well ahead of time what drugs are coming. We get ourselves set up in order to prepare for that. We introduce the drugs through the regulatory and HTA process, which we're starting to do now. But the minute the drugs get approved, we move into a managed access program instead of waiting until it's gone through all the other steps. We can do the PCA negotiations and collection and reanalysis at the end. We don't put them in as barriers before we make them available. I sound like a broken record in this, and that means that we have to have the ability to collect real world evidence, which again, we're able to do, we just have not systematized it well, and we do have some of the data restrictions that we have to be able to overcome in this country. Last thing I'm going to say is that we did have the announcement of the research programs that are starting. Really, the big part about this is to be able to have a national pediatric rare disease clinical trial and treatment network. And this is what's envisioned in there. The call for proposals is being put together. This is a huge step forward because it will signal to the rest of the world that Canada is going to be able to approve and to implement clinical trials across the country in a much faster way. And that, this will allow then the drugs to be able to effectively be tried in Canada, but hopefully also to be available. Next step, just let's work together to make it happen. I didn't mean to go on for so long, but I will stop there and happy to, I guess we have a few minutes if anybody has a question that they would like to push forward.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that presentation. A couple of questions have come up in the comments. First one from Angus. Hello, Angus, good to see you again. He says, can you comment on the impact of Project Orbis on this FDA Health Canada timeline?
Yes, Project Orbis is right now, somewhat limited to cancer drugs. We have been pressing to say we need to have this available right across the scheme. We know that Health Canada in their working through in a very systematic kind of a way wants to make it available. The US is very keen, to kind of make this much more widely available, but I think we're all kind of trying to kind of work it through a step at a time. But definitely what that will happen is that it will allow Canada to be able to get drugs and to be able to evaluate them at the same time as other countries instead of this 1 to 5 year delay. So projects like Project Orbis are a hugely important step that we should be looking at and seeing how we can build on even greater and including other countries as well.
Excellent. And if anyone wants to directly address their question to DURHANE, please just raise your hand and we'll get to you right away. Angus has a second question. How much accountability will the provincial governments have to the federal government for how these funds are actually spent?
Great question. This is what we want to know too. We want to see in these bilateral agreements, right, that this money doesn't just get sent over to the provinces and it's sucked into some kind of coffer. We need to have clearly benchmarked. We need to identify where that money is going. We need to have an accountability trail. So we like the fact that there is an infrastructure that's proposed, that there will be advisory bodies, but we need to be absolutely clear that this is not monies that's going in to actually supplement what they're already doing. It's new monies. It should provide for new infrastructure and to certainly be able to speed up the access to new medicines. But yes, we want to make sure that we build in the accountability measures. Mind you, we know how slippery governments can be.
Thank you very much. One more question from Angus. As more and more cancer treatment is dependent on precision genomics, what are these are considered rare diseases? Will patients have access to these processes?
People ask all the time, what's a rare disease? Is a rare cancer a rare disease? And the answer is that, it's not a number, right? we're talking about, therapies that are designed for small patient populations, which means they have some inherent challenges in terms of clinical trials, in terms of the amount of data you can get, how you actually be able to decide who's going to benefit from it. All of those things are critically a part of it. And whether we're talking about it as a cancer or we're talking about it as a non-cancer or some other kind of disease, it's all exactly the same. So from our perspective, we see and we are trying to promote the rare disease drug strategy as sort of a forerunner of what drug programs ought to look like, for all therapies. And we hope that at the end of the day, everybody's disease becomes a rare disease, because that means that we're able to identify exactly what is the challenge and, in fact, what's the best treatment for you. So, yes, from my point of view, this is a good example of where we want to go. Canada, again, unlike, relative to other countries, has still been relatively low in having a good precision medicines program. We have a strategy, but we haven't implemented. So yes, from our perspective, this is a process that absolutely should be available. We're actually learning a lot, though, from how cancer's already doing some of this.
All right, from Chris, the national strategy is silent on private drug plans, which cover about 2/3 of Canadians. Presumably, a national strategy should include everyone. 1 second, please. How should this national strategy come about?
Yeah, we have resisted federal government since that this is pharmacare. When this is not a pharmacare. This should not be the fact that, okay, all rare disease drugs are now going to move into some kind of a public, drug program, and that we all fund it. Because there are private drug plans. There are lots of people that are covered in private drug plans. So this is a huge challenge in terms of how do we do it. What we do know is that many of the public drug plans, though, are not doing a good job of funding rare disease drugs. I mean, you know that yourself. You have a private drug plan, you have a very expensive drug, you're going to max out that drug plan. If you have a lifetime max on the drug plan, you will max it out. If you have a family maximum per year, you will max it out. The co-pays on private drug plans can sometimes be prohibitive given the cost of these drugs. So we do need a strategy that includes, providing the same conditions to the private drug plans. My personal proposal, I don't know whether you're paying attention to me on this one, is that we take the drug plans and we pool the resources right across the drug plan. So if you have a private drug plan, here's your amount, here's a public drug plan, we create one overarching drug program so that everybody who has that condition would get over the drug, would absolutely be able to qualify for it. And then each drug plan, public or private, would pay into it in the same way, into a pool. So there are pooled examples in other countries, and even in the US, private drug plans actually pool together, especially for some of the gene therapy. So we should include them. I will say is that they have not been talking about how to include them. And we have not seen the private drug plans be as proactive as we feel they ought to be in terms of, how to make this space work. And we are really afraid that in some cases, the private drug plans will say, oh, great, you got a public drug plan. Then we'll just kind of delist that drug altogether. And we'll just assume the public plan will take it on, which can happen, unless there's some good conversation. So it's going to be up to us, even as patients, to really kind of come up with some of the terms that we feel are best.
Mm-hmm. From Lori, is the 50,000 per year of useful life that is used for drug approval a consideration in rare disease treatment approval? It seems like that.
Yes,
this is a question that has come up a lot.
Yeah, I mean, if you read a CADIS review, you will see them say, we've looked at, we've conducted the analysis, and we think that the actual cost per quality for quality adjusted life here, right, is 1.2 million. This is far above the 50,000, which is our ceiling amount. So we expect the drug company to go and negotiate with public drug plans to come up with a figure. I mean, how would you feel, if you had an insurance plan and you have damages that are $1 million, and your insurance policy says, well, I think the maximum we can value is 50,000. So we're going to negotiate with you somewhere between your request for $1 million and my willing to offer you 50,000. I mean, that's what we're saying to people. It's ridiculous. We have said back to CADA, don't even bother doing the calculation. It's useless because all it does is give drug plans an excuse to say, oh my, this is too expensive. Look at this, you're way over kind of what this arbitrary, ridiculous number is. There's no reason for it.
All right, well, that appears to be all the questions that we have for now. I'd like to thank you, DURHANE, for this fantastic talk. It's a lot of good news, and hopefully we'll see something come out of this in the near future.
We invite everybody, whether they're in cancer or any other community, to join us. We will need everybody's help in order to implement it. And we certainly see, this is a drug strategy as a rare disease strategy as really being the foundation for what we would call optimization in terms of access to therapy. So we invite everybody to join us. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Really, really appreciate it, and really appreciate the attention.
Absolutely. And so thank you to you very much. And thanks for everyone for coming around. Just a couple of housekeeping things. This is, once again, one in a series of our webinar series. We have ones coming out throughout the week. Plus, we have a financial survivor, cancer survivor to financial survivor webinar coming up on Tuesday. So if you want to attend that, check out our website. If you haven't received an email from our service, go to our website as well, survivornet.ca, and we will have all of the information there, as well as how you can subscribe to our webinar series. And once again, if you want not just the webinars, but all kind of information, what we're doing, our advocacy, all that other stuff, head on over to survivornet.ca. So thank you very much to everyone, and I hope everyone here has a good day.